Behind Closed Doors, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by McConnell. If someone had told me that August night in 2017 that the case file plopped on my desk by my partner, Del Wilkes, was going to be the last I ever worked on, I would have called them crazy. I had spent 14 years on the police force, working my way up to a position as homicide detective. I believed that within those 14 years I had seen everything there was to see of transgression, tasted every flavor of cruelty, and had seen just about every god-awful thing that this line of work could throw at a person. I thought there was no way I was going to leave that job. It had taken me so long to get there that now I'd arrived, I'd be there till retirement, come hell or high water. I thought a lot of things, and on almost every count, I was wrong. In the end, it wasn't high water that came for me. The case that landed on my desk, the case of Clark Dornan, was to be the last I ever worked as a homicide detective, and in fact, the last I ever worked as a police officer. As far as having seen everything, well, I'd never seen anything like that, and I hope to God I never will again. Opening the file that evening, I recognized Clark immediately. Rising from my chair, I chased the figure of my partner as his hefty frame attempted, unsuccessfully, to recede into the distance. "Hey!" I called after him, watching him slowly, and it seemed to me reluctantly, come to a stop and turn to face me. "Clark died? I mean, you're planning to just palm this one off on me? Even knowing the special relationship that Clark and I enjoyed over the years?" Del sighed deeply and narrowed his eyes at me in the way he always did when he wasn't amused. "You hated him, Tony. We all know you did. Look, I'd go and do it myself, but the gaffer's crawling up my arse about that young girl who went missing a few weeks back. It's just eating up my time. Anyway, Clark's probably not even dead. You'll be back to your desk and charging him with wasting police time by the end of the week." I stared at Del, confused by his final statement. "Sorry, what do you mean he's probably not dead? This is homicide. If he's not dead, then it isn't really our business." Del sighed heavily again. "Have you even looked at the file?" He read the silent response in my expression before I had time to answer, and snatched the brown paper folder from my hand, opening it up on a nearby desk that was neither mine nor his, but was available. "So, obviously, Clark's been in plenty of times over the years complaining about that woman who lives opposite." I nodded, knowing only too well what Del was referring to. Clark Dornan was what we in the department referred to as a crackpot, a lonely man with nothing better to do than harass the police with his own far-fetched tales of murder, mystery, and intrigue. I had sat across from him countless times whilst he explained the logic and evidence he had that his neighbour in the house opposite was some kind of serial killer. This evidence, amassed carefully and invariably scribbled into pocket-sized notebooks, consisted of notes written by Clark on the comings and goings from the house, and probably constituted enough proof to lock Clark himself up as either a peeping Tom or a more benign species of stalker. The basic drive behind Clark's suspicions against his neighbour was that over the past 5 years he had seen a score of young men enter the house and, according to his careful observations, never coming back out again. "Either they're all living there like hermits, or there's more going on. People don't just disappear, except in that house. They all let themselves in with a key they find under the welcome mat, and then that's it. They never come out. They just vanish into the void. Nobody comes to the door to meet them, and they just vanish." When I would press Clark as to whether he had any other evidence, he would invariably offer up the sounds he heard coming from the house. When I asked exactly what these sounds were, he would describe a low, laboured moaning, usually at night, that would go on for a few weeks after each man entered the house, but would then stop abruptly. One time he even brought a tape recorder with some muffled noises he had recorded to show us exactly what he was talking about, though the sounds proved exactly nothing. Without fail, Every one of these visits would end with me or one of my colleagues leading Clark politely out of the station and down the stairs, with assurances that we would keep an ear to the ground and that we would let him know if we decided to make a move on the house, which of course we never did. One lunatic's suspicions and some circumstantial nonsense about disappearing men was not enough for us to get a warrant, even if we wanted to. There was one time, when Clark came in with photographs he had taken of a man entering, that I did take slightly more seriously. The man in the photographs, taken surreptitiously from behind Clark's net curtain, bore a striking resemblance to a man who was already being sought by the police in connection with a rape case. I recognized the fellow from his neck tattoo and pressed Clark for more information. Not because I feared for the man's life, but because if he had indeed entered the house and never left, as Clark insisted he had, then we had the current location of a man we were seeking in connection with our inquiries. On that occasion, I even went to the trouble of visiting the house, more accurately a council-built bungalow at 261 Morton Street, and rapping on the door. When there was no answer, I walked around the back, only to find the back door to the house led out onto a small garden with a scratch of badly kept grass and a manhole cover dead in the centre. This back door, hidden to Clark, who only ever observed the house from his own front window directly opposite the front door, explained the less than impressive magic trick performed by the many men who had entered the house. Clearly, they did not want to be seen exiting, and so made their exit through the rear door. When Clark last came to the station, 3 weeks ago, I had informed him of this. He had come to tell us that not only had the number of men visiting the house increased, but the moaning had also become louder. As if, he said, "There's more of them in there now, all crying out for help." When I confronted him with the possibility that the men simply left through the back door, he was unconvinced and wanted to know what kind of honest person enters by the front and leaves by the back. I told him that the men might not necessarily have been honest, and he took this as proof that the house should be raided. "Something weird is going on in that house. Something not right. You need to check it out." I nodded and assured him that I would, but of course I never did. Until this file arrived. Dell pointed with a pudgy finger to the letter enclosed within the file, written, I knew instantly, in Clark's hand. "Basically, Clark hasn't been seen or heard from for about a fortnight. He sent this letter in to me about 10 days ago, and at the time I just ignored it, but then his sister called in and reported him missing. I happened to mention the note to the gaffer when I heard he'd disappeared, and boom, suddenly we're investigating people who aren't even dead yet." I lifted the letter and began to read. "So you thought you'd pass it on to me like the generous lad you are. Cheers." Dell shrugged and again began making for the door. "Sorry, pal, but I've got other stuff, you know, like people who've actually died." I nodded that I could check it out for him, and Dell gave me a grateful thumbs up as he left. I headed back to my desk to read over the letter. "Dear Detective Wilkes," it began. "I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I would have written to your colleague, Tony, but I've dealt with him before and nothing ever seems to get done, so I am reaching out to you instead." I bristled a little at this, but then reflected that, from his perspective, it was true. What I should perhaps have bristled at was the fact that, despite Clark choosing to avoid me, I still ended up with this case. The letter went on. "In 2 hours' time, I am going to take matters into my own hand. I'm going into the house. I've been watching this place and the things that go on there for years now, and I'm convinced that there's something dodgy about the place. You read about things like this, don't you? Joseph Fritzl keeping those women trapped in his house all those years, or that guy in the US who had girls trapped in his basement? What if all those men are still in there? I've tried getting help. God knows I've tried to give you evidence, and yet you do nothing. Now it's down to me. I'm their last hope, and I won't let them down. I know it might be dangerous, but don't worry, I've taken steps to protect myself. I'm going in." The thought of exactly how Clark might have found the means to protect himself made me stiffen a little, but I continued to read. In the past year, things have really ramped up. Whereas the house used to get maybe one visitor every month, now there's one every few days. All men. They all go in, but none ever come out, and at night I hear them moaning. Louder now, as if there are groups of them. It's horrible and it's not right. All the times I came into the police station, nobody took me seriously or asked the important questions. Nobody looked into who actually lives there. Nobody asked why it is that nobody else ever comes out of the house. How does the person who lives there survive? They never have deliveries of food. They never leave to buy food. How could they survive? Again, I thought of the back door and considered that the house's inhabitants must use that as an exit and entrance for their own comings and goings, possibly to avoid the prying eyes of their weirdo neighbour. I'm going in, and, I hope, coming out with liberated victims. Today is July the 30th. If I'm not seen or heard from within a week, send someone in after me. If I don't come out, then you know that I was right. Something terrible is happening in 261, and something terrible has probably happened to me. I have met the same fate as the others who entered that cursed house, but I will have died a hero. Clark's delusions were clearly not confined to paranoia. Delusions of grandeur were also on the menu. Shaking my head and placing down the letter, almost in disbelief that the gaffer wanted us to actually check this out, I decided to key the address into a search engine and find out who did in fact live there. The results were interesting, to say the least. The first result was an image of an attractive, dark-haired young woman in a state of partial undress. It was from a less than reputable dating site, and gave the address beneath a flirtatious few lines in which this woman promised a good time to anyone who decided to stop by. The woman pictured, from the waist up, was fairly good-looking. She had jet-black hair cut into a short bob that came down to just past her ears at an angle that emphasized a very feminine neckline. In the photo, she stared into the camera with a sultry, suggestive sideways glance that was coupled with a half-smile. The other notable element of the image, and indeed every subsequent photograph I found of her, was the eyes. Whether the image had been doctored or not I was unsure, but in every image she had irises that were of a bright, radiant yellow. I ran an image search on the photographs and found at least 6 other examples of the same lady, referred to in every reference only as Jennifer. In every instance she shared her site with other women in even greater states of undress with their addresses listed. For someone who had obsessed over this address for so long, Clark clearly hadn't done much research. Then I looked up the residential address in the city records in the hope of finding someone registered to the address, perhaps through the electoral register. No results were found. As far as the council records were concerned, the house should have been unoccupied. At first, I considered taking these findings upstairs to the gaffer, explaining that these were clearly advertisements for a woman working in the oldest profession, and that the reason Clark never saw the men leave is because they exited the building from the back door, so as to avoid being seen. Visits to the house and liaisons with Jennifer not being the sort of thing you want every man and his dog to know about. I stopped short of actually taking the results to him, however, as I could already anticipate his response. He would no doubt underline the fact that we don't know for certain that the men left by the back door. We definitely know that Clark didn't, and that in all fairness, if there is a vice case to be made in that house and the business operating from there, shouldn't I have known about it all along? I decided to simply go to the house, with the expectation that I knew already what I was going to find. Arriving at the door of number 261, I contemplated for a moment whether I should simply use the key under the mat that Clark had mentioned, but knew, of course, that to do so would be to enter without a warrant or the proper clearance, meaning that on the off chance there was some crime to be reported, I would not have the legal grounds to be there. I decided instead to knock at the door and see what, if anything, I could see through the net-curtained windows. Having received no answer, I moved around to the back of the house, reasoning that if it was the exit used most frequently, I might get a better answer there. Upon seeing the back door, I found that it had been left slightly ajar. However, across the tiny crack that the door had opened, a spider had been busy constructing a web. Judging by the amount of webbing, which ran from the edge of the door to the door frame and extended almost the full length of the frame, it must have been the work of several spiders, and indicated that nobody had passed in or out of this door for quite some time. Otherwise the webs would have been disturbed. I thought for a moment about disturbing the webs myself and stepping into the house this way, but decided against it. Clark might have been a crackpot, and there may have been no evidence of anything approaching the severity of murder, but there was certainly something dodgy about this place. Men did not simply wander into an unlisted and supposedly uninhabited house, and women did not advertise their addresses online if there wasn't something strange going on. Reflecting upon this, and the fact that if there were people inside it would be best and look better in my report if I entered from the front, I moved back around to the front of the house. Having made my way back around to the front door, one thing struck me more than anything else: the smell. For a second I wondered if it might have something to do with the open drain in the center of the back garden, but realized soon enough that this was a different kind of hateful aroma. The stench was wretched, a horrible, yogurty sourness, like the smell of rotten meat. The closer I got to the door, the more overpowering the odor was, to the extent that I wondered how anyone, no matter how desperate they were to get their end away, could not be put off by it. Having reached the door, I made a decision. As a homicide detective, I had been to enough gruesome crime scenes to be able to recognize that smell. The door before me was rotten close to the hinges, the wood itself seeming to have become damp and decayed, but it was not the cause of the odor. Seeing that this door also was slightly ajar, I decided that the smell of death coming from inside the house was enough to give me just cause to enter. I could write it up later as a suspicion of foul play based upon the stench. Covering my mouth and nose with the forearm pressed tightly to my lips, I entered the house and took out my pocket torch. Inside the hallway, the house looked fairly normal, but both dark and empty, as if it had not been lived in for quite some time. The floor was thick with dust, and made a gravelly, rasping crunch underfoot. The bare wires hanging from the ceiling and the lack of light bulb attached to it confirmed instantly that flipping the switch would be no use. No light entered from the windows, before which thick curtains were drawn. At this point, I am happy to admit that my vision of sauntering in, making a vice bust, and strolling out again had vanished. Unless it was catering for a clientele with very specific interests in nocturnal fauna or harboring a rather left-field haunted house fetish, this was not the sort of environment one visited looking for a good time. The story didn't fit. Again, I called out, hoping that someone would answer, but I received only silence in return. I rounded the corner toward the living room, hearing my own footsteps heavy on the uncarpeted floor, drawing from the boards with every step a yawning, wailing screech as the wood creaked loudly. Aside from that sound, however, the entire place was silent. There was a stillness in that house that seemed to me unnatural, as if the air inside had not been disturbed for decades. Though it was warm outside, the atmosphere inside was of a different kind of warmth, a close, stifling humidity in which the air felt thick as if it had a weight and substance of its own. It is hard to accurately describe, but there was an overwhelming sense of patience to the air, as if it were waiting, lurking, and biding its time until someone was stupid enough to intrude upon it. Again, I called into the darkness. This time, there was an answer. Having been asked many times since, I have always tried to search for the correct word to describe that sound. The closest I have ever come is a skittering. It was a sound of movement, a rush or patter of feet, such as one might perhaps expect to hear from rodents scurrying away. However, it did not have the busy, haphazard sound of mice or rats. This skittering, a soft and yet somehow pointed sound, was somewhere between a rustle and scratch, the sound you might imagine a dead leaf, dried and crisp, might make if blown across the floor by a stiff breeze. In pursuit of the sound, I turned the corner into the living room and stopped dead. Whatever had made the sound disappeared out through the door to the kitchen. I didn't see it clearly, but I did see the shadow projected against the wall. On the strength of that alone, I would have been reluctant to give chase. As it was, I was fixed to the spot by the vision that presented itself to me. What I had stumbled into simply by turning the corner in a small suburban council house was a tomb. Against the walls of the room, each wound up in what looked like a sleeping bag made of thin grey cotton, were men, or at least what remained of them. Each individual was skeletally thin and barely conscious. Some were only partial remains, a head and torso, an arm still encased in that thin muslin cotton and strung up to the wall. Remnants of limbs dangled from the ceiling like horrible ornaments, while some of the men, emaciated, their skin a milky white and yellow, were suspended face down from the ceiling as if they had been glued there by their backs. Their eyes stared downwards, hollow and empty, and from one or two a soft, low moan like the reedy sound you get by blowing into the neck of an empty glass bottle escaped their mouths, which lolled slackly open. Every surface in the room was covered or encrusted with layer upon layer of what looked like finicky spun candy floss. This stuff was off-white, but also gave off a faintly phosphorescent glow. Within the mass which yawned down from the ceiling and walls, arcing inward like the throat of some giant creature, were thinner tendrils, stretches of the stuff that varied between being as thick as a man's thigh and as thin as fishing wire. Reams of the stuff wrapped and interlaced over itself, so that in some places it seemed thin and in others as thick as a blanket or a forgotten lump of cement, and within it all, in every direction I looked, the suspended relics and remains of men. On one wall were shapes, outlines, like the figure of a person with a sheet draped over them, the suggestion of a hip or the curve of a shoulder bleeding into the leg of the next. On another wall, a shoe hung suspended, whilst half of a briefcase jutted out at a strange angle. For several moments, I simply stood, rooted to the spot by confusion, disbelief, and terror. I stood stock still, assessing just how close I was to the lines of this webbing, something within me telling me instinctively that if I were to misstep, to allow this stuff to stick to me and feel myself becoming entangled, I might never make it out of this house. Then, as if snapping awake from some daydream, I came to my senses as I heard the back door swing open. I wanted to run, to sprint through the kitchen and out into the garden, but I knew I couldn't. Instead, I hunched my shoulders, pulling my jacket off and using it as a shield, trying as best I could not to touch this God-forsaken stuff and to avoid at all costs the stuff touching me. By the time I got out the back door, I was just in time to see a dark shape disappearing out of sight, as if swallowed by the small patch of scrub and lawn. I ran nearer and saw only the open black circle of the manhole, the cover flung to one side and the shaft leading down into the sewer below. Standing there and looking down into that concrete cylinder, looking for all the world like the gaping mouth of some awful leech, sucking and swallowing the light that faded after a few feet into a pit of black, I felt my stomach turn and vomited onto the grass. By the time reinforcements and ambulances arrived, I had dragged a table from the kitchen out into the garden, flipped it upside down, and placed it over the manhole cover. I had then piled several other kitchen items on top of that, trying as best as I could to ensure that whatever had retreated into the darkness below could not get out. Or at least, it couldn't get out here. In total, the remains of 32 men were recovered from that house. 4 were still alive, but almost completely catatonic, and 1, Clark, could speak only in stuttered, nonsensical sentences. The bodies that were found were examined and were described to me in private by the pathologist as having been sucked dry. "Someone or something," he said gravely, "has liquefied the muscle tissue and fat and extracted it slowly through several large puncture wounds across the body, like some form of slow liposuction, the way you might suck the flesh and juice from a segment of orange." He paused, raising a hand to his forehead as if to steady himself. "Worse still, the tissue shows decomposition at different rates. Some parts of the body had died and begun to rot months ago, whilst some still had blood vessels that gave up working only a few days ago. The victims were kept alive, possibly conscious, whilst this process was taking place." Considering he did not have access to the details of how the victims were found, his final words chilled me beyond expression. "They were kept alive and almost fed upon whilst still alive, like flies in a spider's web." That description haunted me. Haunted me because of the things that Clark was able to say before he was taken to the psychiatric ward. Things about how she had lured them there to feed on them, of how he had become ensnared in the fabric, and how she, with supernatural speed, had darted forward, her massive legs working with horrifying speed to twist and entangle him until he was bound up, unable to fight, unheard as he screamed. He told of how he waited, how, if he turned his head far enough, he could just make her out in the corner of his eye, perched in the upper right-hand corner of the room, 8 feet from the floor, pressed and huddled against the ceiling. He wept as he recounted how for days he could only make out the vague outline of her shape, but how on the 5th day he had watched her creeping ever so slowly, closer and closer towards him. How he had tried, kicked and screamed against his bonds, unable to move as she approached on thin spindle legs, ever closer. How one of her legs, thick with long bristling black hairs, had actually touched him before she had passed by and begun to feed on another live meal. Of course, these mutterings were dismissed offhand as nonsense by most, but not by me. There never was a conclusive answer. No explanation for what happened to those men, except for a few salacious rumors about how a few of them were on the sex offenders register, and one had previous convictions for soliciting. No identification was ever made of the material or fabric that somehow wound full-grown men up like prizes and suspended them from the walls and ceiling like decorations. no real answers as to who she was, or what, in God's name, was capable of winding full-grown men up in its web. Some, of course, looked to me for answers. After all, I had been the only one to really see what was in that house. My answer has always been the same. I told the truth. Told them, as I'm telling you, about the web of tombs, of the men encased like flies for later consumption, and of how I'd heard something move when I called. I also tell the truth about what I saw, which wasn't much, but was enough. Enough to make me quit the force and to never sleep well another night in my life. What I actually saw was a shadow, a dark shape slipping into the manhole. When I'm pressed and people ask what the shadow looked like, I always answer that to explain would be pointless, that a shadow isn't accurate, that it can be warped and distorted by other objects in the room, stretched and pulled by the position of the light source. What it showed might not be real, I say. Sometimes the listener is convinced, but rarely do I manage to convince myself. For what I saw, or thought I saw, was in its upper portions a woman. The head, shoulders, chest, and arms throwing the silhouette one would expect from an average-size adult female, though, of course, that silhouette was strangely positioned as she crawled, belly inches from the floor and with terrifying speed, skittering towards the door. The upper portions, though strangely positioned, were normal. It was the back end, the swollen, bulbous mass she dragged behind her, the mess of knuckles and sinews that flickered past each other with strange, almost mechanical locomotion that made the thing obscene. I tell those who ask that, whatever it was I saw, it moved on more than 2 legs. But, more than what I saw, I think it was the lack of answers that made me leave. I always suspected, you see, that the lack of answers from my superiors came from a reluctance to face the questions that would follow. What was that thing? Where did it come from? And is it the only one? More importantly, after slithering into the sewers that extend like an interconnected network beneath the entire city, and from which it could emerge at any time, where did it go? Could it still be down there? And, most importantly, where is it now? That final question is one I think about a lot. This has been Behind Closed Doors, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.